afternoon, everybody. We are in the afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you for joining us for the 13th annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and assisting me today in the internal communications track is Lori Freund from the Bridges Library System. So thank you, Lori. This is our final track, our final session in this track. We've had two great presentations already, and now we have Jim Robinson, and Jim is in Minnesota, so not too far from us. And he's going to be talking about embodied communication and might be asking you to do some participatory things in this presentation. So feel free to do that. And then Jim will take questions at the end. So Jim, please begin.
Great. Well, Jamie, thank you so much. Thank you, Lori. It's very nice to be here. I was talking earlier about my Wisconsin experience, and I have much to learn about Wisconsin, even though I've enjoyed my time there very much. So thanks. This is a webinar that is called Embodied Communication. And one of the reasons why I chose this slide is because I think that we can certainly tell that this cat is having an embodied experience. And the subtitle of this, of course, is How to Dismantle Your Stress Response. So, what I would like to do is I'll tell you a little bit about myself. We're going to talk a little bit about what embodied communication is. We're going to do some little exercises, and then I'm going to use the chat to find out how you embody communication yourself and what you would recommend and all of that. And then at the very end, we'll have some questions. So here we go. My name is Jim Robinson. I live here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm originally from the Los Angeles area, and I have kind of a dual career. I have been teaching psychology at St. Catherine, St. Kate's, and St. Thomas here in St. Paul. I also have been teaching at the University of Minnesota and at Gustavus Adolphus College and at Metro State, and then at several junior colleges around the Twin Cities. And it's not that I keep getting fired, it's that I've always been an adjunct professor because my other career is in sketch comedy and in improvisation. And so I was a main stage member of the Brave New Workshop for quite a while, a long time ago. And lately, I've been working with a theater group called the Theater of Public Policy, where we create improvised shows based on interviews with either policymakers or politicians. And so it's been a big part of my life, and I've been able to combine the two by doing a lot of work using improvisational technique to help, for example, police officers, social workers, psychologists, occupational therapists, people that tend to work in either very stressful situations or in very vulnerable situations, how they can communicate. And one of the things that keeps coming up is that in order for us to communicate well, particularly in situations that require our full presence and that require a lot of delicacy and a lot of compassion for the person that we're talking with, we have to have good embodied communication. And so one thing about embodied communication is that it is often referred to as body language. And it's true that it is partially about body language, but it involves also our facial gestures and our vocal tone as well. So what we're going to do today is talk about what embodied communication is in some very specific ways, and then how we can make sure that we are responding rather than reacting by having some control over our stress response. So I'll start with this. We're going to say goodbye to the cat. We're a cat household here, so I'm drawn to that. And I want to start also by kind of putting some parameters on the whole notion of what embodied communication is. Embodied communication can be it can be manipulative. It can be something that is used for better or for worse as a way to convince or control other people. But that doesn't particularly interest me because I think that in some ways denigrates the entire experience. So what I'd like to talk about first is what we can control and what we cannot control in terms of our communication. So the things that are out of our control are what other people think of us. Again, we're usually projecting onto other people in some fashion. And so their opinion of me or their opinion of you probably has more to do with them. So we don't have a whole lot of control over that. The actions of others, of course, we want to protect vulnerable people, children, elderly. We want to be decent human beings, but the actions of others are often beyond our control. We certainly can't control the future. We can hope for it, we can work toward it, but we cannot control it. The past is already done, of course. We can't necessarily control what happens around us, although we can take part in creating a more positive environment. What other people think of you or of me, sort of like the opinions we talked about earlier, but that's out of our control. The outcome of my efforts, and also how others take care of themselves. And if any of you have done work in social work, as I have, you'll know that um, we can help people help themselves, and we can protect people in some degree. But what people decide to do with their lives is their own business. And so communication is not, at least in this case, is not meant to control other people. But what is within our control, and that's what we're going to be looking at today, are your thoughts and your actions, or my thoughts and my actions, the goals that you decide to set, where you give your energy, how you speak to yourself, how you handle challenges, and then particularly what your boundaries are. And so we're going to talk about communication as something that we're responsible for, and something that is used as a way to connect and collaborate with other people rather than to control them. So there we go. Um, let's take a look at the next slide. And you'll notice here that I have my slides here on the bottom as well. So I do that because that way I know what's coming up. All right. So, like I said earlier, with embodied communication, it helps us connect with our audience or with our conversation partner before we start to uh, dive into content. And what's interesting about these kind of webinars is I know that I'm talking to you. I know that I'm speaking with many people on the other side of this screen, but I don't know if I'm connecting with you. And so I will try using the chat a little bit, but I'm more saying this than demonstrating it at the moment. Anyway, as far as connecting with people, there's a famous study that was done by a man whose name was Morabian, and Morabian looked at the effect of body language and particularly vocal tone on how people communicated with one another. And what he found was that if a person's message and their body and their voice were in alignment, that people were able to understand the content and to retain it, that they could remember it. What he also found is that when our bodies and our voice are at odds with what we're saying, that, and that happens all the time, that a lot of times people will remember body language more prominently. They'll remember, the person who fidgeted, or the person who seemed uncomfortable, or the person who seemed closed, or they will remember the voice, the vocal tone. They'll remember somebody who spoke too softly, or who spoke too quickly, or somebody who didn't seem to have control over the modulation of their voice for whatever reason. And in that case, the content of what they said was lost. In fact, if you'll look here, you can see the percentages that if there is a disconnect between what a person is saying and the way that a person is saying it, people tend to devote their attention, about 55% of their attention or their retention, what they remember, to the body language, about 38% to vocal tone or voice tone, and about 7% to the content. So it seems to me that it's very important for us to be able to embody our communication, to have our body and our voice and our face serve the content. Otherwise, we're going to lose people. So let's take a look at that, the next thing. I love this slide. I absolutely love this slide. This slide is from a website called Neurodivergent Insights, and this community is getting a lot of well-deserved attention lately. People, you all know this, but people who are neurodivergent, who describe themselves as such, their ability to process information and to process stimulation is different from people who are neurotypical. And this shows itself in all sorts of ways. And there's some controversy around whether this is getting overused. But one of the things that really interests me about this, about the neurodivergent experience, is that it's very, very intimately and obviously connected to our fight or flight response, to our autonomic nervous system. People who are neurodivergent have to find more deliberate, explicit ways to calm themselves down so that their body doesn't tell them signals or doesn't give them signals that interfere with their communication. So, for example, a person who is neurodivergent might very easily be overwhelmed by a conversation or be overwhelmed by the sounds in a room or be overwhelmed in having to give a presentation. And this happens to all of us, whether we're neurotypical or neurodivergent. And through this information, a lot of them have shared things that they have done in order to calm their nerves, to calm their fight or flight response, and be able then to allow their body to serve them rather than to betray them or protect them unnecessarily. So let's take a look at some of the things that the neurodivergent people have shared with us. And then I'd like to use the chat function and find out some of the things that you've done. So, for example, one way that neurodivergent people reset their nervous system, and again, they're doing this in order to be relaxed and to allow their body to serve their message, is doing something simple like placing a fan in front of their face and focusing on the sensation. One of the things that seems to be very powerful if we're trying to have embodied communication is for us to be able to tell our body to relax, even though it might be telling us that we have to fight or we have to flee. And so putting a face in front I'm sorry, putting a fan in front of their face and focusing on that sensation, it takes the power away and the focus away from our beating heart or our gasping lungs or our clenched fists or our shoulders which are hunched over in protection, and instead it allows us to feel this sensation on our face, to relax, to put the focus there. What's also interesting about this is that when we talk about, with this particular example, anything that's cold or anything that is soft and is gently touching our face, this causes the muscles around our eyes to relax. It causes our jaw to relax. And these are two places where a lot of us hold our tension. And in doing so, our facial gestures will betray our anxiety or our fear or our discomfort. And so if we can learn to relax them, then our face becomes more flexible, and in consequence, our voice becomes more controlled. I see that somebody's writing something in the chat. I'm just going to check it out. Uh, Somebody's saying here, I use fidgets, which I ground myself and physically let the tension of the nerves out through my hands. The pressure and activity pulls me out of nerves and out of the panic response. Absolutely. Yeah, precisely. That's great. So we started with that first example. Somebody mentioned fidgeting. That's true. I'm one of those people that bounces his knee all the time, or if I have a pen in my hand, I'm constantly wiggling it. These things, what they do, as I said earlier, is they tell our autonomic nervous system, our fight or flight response, that we can relax. Another thing that is interesting to do if you want to have a more embodied communication is to find a way to loosen your jaw. So, for example, chewing on ice, while your dentist might not be too happy about that, anything that uses your mandible right here, anything that can use that can calm us down and can begin to get us back into our body and out of our fight or flight response. You'll notice that there's that term rumination that cattle do, where they constantly chew. One of the things that humans do, and we are not ruminators, but one of the things that we do when we chew is it takes us out of our anxiety, and it allows us to very, very deliberately and rhythmically relax ourselves. Um, Things that other people do: put on dance music, take a cold shower. Cold water is very bracing. Again, it takes us out of that fear. Um, I love this term, stim through it. Somebody mentioned that over here in the chat, which I really appreciate. That anything that we can do to kind of stimulate ourselves and to take our attention away from our body or away from our beating heart. So things like fidgets and pencils and tapping can be very, very powerful. All of those things. And then you can see, I love these. Spend time with your pet. Put on essential oils. Use a weighted blanket. Again, the idea is to use your body as a vessel of communication, and in order for it to communicate, you have to really, really let it relax. And we can do that, but we have to find ways that are usually rhythmic and that are usually repetitive to help us do that. So, if you don't mind, let's take a second and look in the chat. I will read some of these chats out loud, some of these responses. And Jamie, if you want to help, that'd be fantastic too. Um,
Yeah.
what are some things that you have found yourself doing that cause your body to kind of settle into itself and that over helps you overcome the fight or flight response?
Yeah, so please take a minute and share something. You can share something that you are seeing on the screen, or if there's something not on the screen, feel free to share that as well. Sarah says simple yoga poses.
Great. Nathan says sour things. Nathan, would you mind saying a little bit more in the chat just to explain? Because that's fascinating. Oh, that box breathing, the 444. Essential oils. Yeah.
You know, I've tried weighted blankets and I have found them to be constricting for me. I found that to make me almost more nervous. So that was something that I found did not work for me.
We have cats who sleep on the bed, and so I am constantly either having tremendous claustrophobia or deep relief, and so it goes back and forth. Uh, People talk about t chewing on the inside of their cheek. Um, your dentist would not recommend it, but that is that rumination that's using your mandible like that. Chewing gum, yeah, interesting.
I can see where the gum chewing would help. As you said that the chewing helps relax us.
Yeah, here's this
Okay,
one.
so
Yeah,
Nathan said the warhead candy or a lemon is a shock to my system.
yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because even cold water can be a shock to your system, and I love that. I love sour things, and that burst you get when of salivation when you have something really sour. It takes you again. It takes you out of the anxiety and more into your physicality. Um, do you see, Jamie?
Caitlin said four things you can touch, three things you can hear, two things you can smell, one thing you can taste.
Great. All right. Well, these are all wonderful. In the interest of moving along, I'm going to do a couple things that I have been using, working with social workers, particularly in finding ways to relax in very, very tense situations. Um, and we'll just do two of them today, if that's okay with you. So you can see me on my screen here. Many of you probably do things like this, but this is something that is very useful. And I'd like you all, if you're at home, if you're wherever you are, I can't see you, but if you would link your thumbs like this and put them kind of toward the top of your sternum, your breastbone between your rib cage, so that your fingers are very lightly, very, very lightly, just tapping underneath your shoulder. And what's going to happen, and I really do encourage you to do this with me, and then I'll ask for your response on the chat. We're going to very, very lightly and very rhythmically, we're just going to tap like this. And if you would like, you can just kind of follow me and tap in sync with me, and then we'll talk about this. So let's take a few seconds. You'll see, and then I have some questions for you. Here we go. Okay, and then if you just slowly stop. All right. Before we talk about the value of this and why we're doing this particular formation, would you mind in the chat, and maybe Jamie, you can come back and help me with that if you wouldn't mind. Tell me, what was your experience of that like? How did that feel for you? And I'll look over here while we do this.
Oh, I'm seeing regulated my breathing, became more aware of my breathing. Natalie said for some reason tapping really helps me calming, quieting, calming. Pam said calming. Mark said like being held. Another more aware of breathing. Natalie said tapping softly was better. Focused to time my tapping to match yours, and it focused my breathing. Susan said good. It reminded me of my cat kneading on a blanket. Focused my mind.
This is wonderful. These are great. One of the things about this, and this is just an example, is that you're doing something that is very useful if you're trying to get embodied, if you're trying to get into your body and out of your head. Um, you you'll always want to be able to cross your midline, through the midsection of your body where your central nervous system is, your spinal cord, and then up into obviously up into your brain and beyond. So whenever we cross the midline, whenever we do anything that involves both sides of our body, and particularly crossing that midline, we encourage our nervous system to let go of narrative. And that sounds a little bit, I don't know, I don't know what it sounds like. Can't say what it sounds like. However, it does seem to be true that whenever we do anything like that, that it tends to break up our persistent and often negative narratives. So let me ask you this question, and I'll look on the chat again if you don't mind. While we were doing this, people talked about it being calming. They talked about it being like their cat kneading on a blanket. They talked about all these things. How many of you found yourself doing this and at the same time thinking about going to the grocery store, or thinking about what you're going to do after this conference, or thinking about politics, or thinking about any of the whatever kind of chores or errands that you have to do while you were doing this? How many of you were capable of doing that? Most of us aren't, but did any of you find that you had a difficult time keeping that? And if you wouldn't mind, Jamie, that'd be great.
Yep. Jennifer said this totally quieted my mind. I know for me, I really didn't think of much of anything else. I was just kind of focusing on what we were doing.
Right.
Does anyone else have any thoughts you'd like to share in chat? Did you find your mind going to other places? Lori said, I didn't think of anything else either. Kate said, no to-do list here.
Yeah.
Keitra said, first time today, my mind quieted.
Yeah, that's great. I love doing this. I could, if you want to hire me for an hour, I'll do.
We'll do it once a week.
Yeah. Oh, this is great. Wow. So thank you. Yeah. So one of the things about this exercise, and you all have your own way of doing it. So people in the previous chat talked about just going for a walk, doing dishes, folding sheets, anything. If we do it mindfully and if we do it intentionally, it if it crosses our midline and if it has some repetition to it, it tends to disrupt our negative narratives. Um, and I love her. I'll read this one out loud if you don't mind. Kelly writes, I briefly thought what others would think if they saw me doing this, but I forgot about that quickly. Yeah, so a lot of that self-consciousness, if we can find ways to get embodied, to get into our bodies and out of our narratives, out of our minds, then we're much stronger going into a communication. Nathan writes, I started thinking about different rhythms. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's do another one very quickly. So if you're sitting down as I am, just kind of let your arms shake off to the side. If we were doing this in person, I would ask all of us to look at each other and smile. If you want, you can look into your Zoom grid and smile. I just had a dental implant, so I'm going to smile as much as I want because that thing cost a ton. And this is something that is going to be working with our voice. So the butterfly tapping, that tends to work with our body. One of the things that Morabian talked about is that when our voices are out of control, when they're being controlled by our autonomic nervous system, our fight or flight response. Our voices tend to become harsh. They tend to become a little bit more staccato. And particularly for men, they start to become very swallowed. They tend to come from the back of the throat. And that tends to do two things. It tends to either alienate people or it tends to threaten them. you'll notice that and again, this might sound a little bit sexist. I don't mean it to sound that way. But one of the reasons why babies tend to be drawn more to female voices than to male voices is that female voices have a lot of fluidity, a lot of mellifluous movement in them. And men's voices, particularly American men, American English, tends to come from the back of the throat. It tends to be kind of flat. And babies are not drawn to that as much. And in fact, oftentimes they'll be, like I said, a bit alienated from it. So one of the goals in embodied communication is not only to relax your body, but also to allow your voice to become a little bit more mellifluous or melodious, to use the entire range of your voice. The other thing about using the entire range of your voice, which I think is really interesting, is that when you use the whole range of your voice, it also allows your face to become much more flexible and much more expressive. And when your voice becomes more expressive, the muscles around your eyes and in your jaw relax. And there is some evidence that it also improves your hearing, but I'm not qualified to talk about that. So anyway, let's try this again. If you don't mind, I'd like you to take your three middle fingers on each hand and place them on your cheekbones right up here, not on your eye, but right here. And just kind of follow me. This is very strange doing this into the void, but here we are. All right. So we're going to hum, and we're going to hum at as high a pitch as we can. Doesn't really matter. Here we go. Jamie, would you mind helping me with this again? Would you mind? Thank you.
Sure.
So while we're doing this, I'd like you take your hands away from your cheeks, and if you would, in the message, tell me what does that feel like while you're doing this, and I'll hum just for a second more. Your dog is very interested in what is happening. That's very funny. Great. I like the vocals. I was trying to match your pitch. Please, I'm a horrible singer. Horrible singer. Um, Could you, I'll ask a more specific question, but could you feel the vibration? Yeah, your cheeks are vibrating. Could you feel it in your sinus cavity and maybe in your gums, perhaps even in your teeth? I might have a sinus infection. This is not a diagnostic experience. Um, yeah.
Cheeks were
Well,
vibrating.
one of the things about, yeah, getting a few from coworkers, well, you're going to get another one, Eric, very quickly. So one of the things about doing that is that it loosens up, like I said, it loosens up the muscles around your eyes. We're going to do this, and I'm going to show you something. I will do it here. If you can do it without getting fired, please join in. A very helpful way to get your embodiment in your voice and particularly in the mask of your face is to do this. Start with that high hum, and then to release your voice without letting it dip down. So if it helps you, imagine that your voice is a visual element. And so you're watching your voice continue to go higher. You're not letting it sink down into your chest or into your throat. So here we go. And I will do this quickly. And this is going to be filmed. I should send this to my mom. And then you open up your voice. Try that if you can. And well, I'll do it one more time and then we'll get Jamie back and we'll talk about this. So, Jamie, do you mind coming back for a second? Thanks. Thank you for doing that. What did you notice happening when you released your coworkers think you're crazy, no doubt. When you released your breath and you let the sound come out from that high pitch, did you notice anything? And if not, don't sweat. No, don't sweat it. It's no big deal. But if you did, I'd love to know what you noticed.
I found that more relaxing.
Well,
That
you,
that
yeah, can you tell me what it was about that was relaxing?
I don't know. I just felt like my face relaxed more. And Jennifer said the same thing. I didn't feel the vibration, but I felt my entire face relax.
Yeah, yeah. Um, that's great. What is and Kate says,
It's way higher than I usually let my voice get.
right, like letting
Teresa
it,
said, yeah, Teresa said my fingers left my face at the same time, like letting everything go.
oh, that's great. Yeah. Can we go back to? I love both those comments. I'd like to go back to what Kate said. It's way higher than I usually let my voice get. Uh, Again, this is not, I'm not suggesting that any of us go out there and try to change the pitch of our voice or try to, you know, to I don't know, to try to become more musical. But if we can find ways that allows us to use the whole range of our voice, the higher points, the lower points, all that stuff in between, particularly if we're male and we have a flatter voice, for lack of a better word, this it draws people in. It does what Morabian talks about. It allows people to hear the content rather than to focus on the voice. And it also allows us to relax our facial features, which tends to invite people in. So my cat, he is here. Come up here. Anyway, that's fine. So the first several slides, this is about ways that you can relax your body, particularly telling your body to let go of the fight or flight response. So we talked about, how you can do the different tapping, the different rhythmic movements. We talked about this. So that's the beginning of embodiment. Once we get there, once our bodies are relaxed, then it's time to really look at how our cognitive processing either helps us become embodied or gets in the way. So let's look at the next slide. Here we go. I'm very proud of this, even though I apparently swiped it from photo case. And now I've recorded myself saying that. Anyway, one of the things that I find really interesting about being in the moment and being in your body is that once your body is relaxed, your cognition changes. And it doesn't have to necessarily go in that order, but it can be very useful. And what I'm going to show you now are three different slides that come out of improvisational theory. Improvisational theory, as you all know, it has its roots in jazz, it has its roots in dance, and it has its roots in theater. And the idea is, of course, that you can create any kind of scene or song or dance without planning in advance, that you're inspired by everything that's happening in the moment and that you are genuinely moved, your body and your voice are genuinely moved by directions that are coming from your body and from your collaboration with other people. So it's the exact opposite in many ways of trying to memorize or trying to prepare. Preparation is great. I'm not saying we shouldn't prepare, but when we have all of that improvisational energy, we can be much, much, much more available to the people that we're talking with, and we have much greater access to all of the things that we have either studied or prepared for, or that we are emotionally capable of. Anyway, so the first rule of improvisation, which I think helps us become more embodied, is the rule of yes and. And so let me say this. In improvisation, I'll just read this quickly, and I'm sorry to read from the slide, but in improvisation, we make it a habit of saying yes and to whatever arises. So if we are, for example, we're in communication with somebody, um, and they're talking to us. If we are truly embodied, and if we're saying yes and, we are acknowledging what they're saying. And I'm going to use the chat again, if you don't mind, Jamie, if you wouldn't mind. How do we let people know that we're acknowledging them without always saying yes and to everything they say, because that could become a bit cumbersome. But how do you let somebody know that you are acknowledging what they're saying and acknowledging their presence? And if you don't mind, we'll just look at the chat quickly.
Right.
Yeah, head nodding, right?
Mhm.
Good.
I was going to say the same thing, a head nod.
Right. Head nodding. And that's crucial. There are a few other things that we do, and I'm wondering if people have noticed them as well. Making eye contact, right? And eye contact, particularly if you're relaxed, tends to be much more appropriate. The ability to lean in, yeah. Smile and head nod. I'm doing that right now. Um, Anything else come to mind? I'll say, if you don't mind, I'll say a few things that I've also noticed as well, is that when we are acknowledging people, yes, thank you, Mark, having an open posture. So literally opening up our heart and opening up our lungs to the person in front of us. Again, we don't think about this while it's happening, but we recognize it right away. Uh, I taught developmental psychology for years, and one of the things that fascinated me most, and this is tied right in with embodied communication, is how from birth we look to other people to reflect back our own emotional state. And those of you who have infants or have spent time with infants, you know that if you look at a baby with a flat face, or you talk to them in kind of a flat voice, they tend to panic right from the start. It takes about 2 or 3 seconds before their bodies will tense up, their fists will clasp, they'll kick back, they'll resist. Which is why so many times when we're holding babies, we engage in that kind of baby talk, that sing-songy thing, and our voice, our foreheads get very big, our eyes get big, our mouth gets, you know, how do you talk about that? And we mirror the baby, and the baby then sees himself or herself in us, and then the baby begins to relax, usually. So yes, and is that it's that very thing. It's that primal need that we have to know that other people see us. And if we can grant that to somebody else, then chances are they'll grant it to us, although we can't control that. And then we will be able to connect with somebody. So the ability to say yes and to acknowledge is very important. The other reason why saying yes is so important is that it makes the word no, which is also an embodied response, it should be, very, very, very crucial. When we say no, our body changes. Our eyebrows tend to come together. Our voice becomes more staccato. A lot of times, our shoulders and our arms will kind of lean in to protect ourselves, or if it requires it, and this is very, it depends on the situation, of course, or we become more aggressive. But no has a place. One of the things that I find fascinating is that if yes and becomes our mantra, it becomes our default position, and we are reaching out to people appropriately and with good intent and with interest, then when we say no, we are able to set boundaries that actually mean something. It's not just a constant dribble of negativity. It's a very distinct no. And so in embodied communication, we say no to anything that diminishes another person or anything that goes against our personal values and goes against our boundaries. So, for example, embodied communication, of course, embodied communication happens in all sorts of um, prejudicial communication, in racist, sexist, homophobic communication. People embody that while they're doing it. But if we want to use embodied communication in a way that is open and inviting and generative, that creates more conversation, which is something that I think we need, then we remain open and we keep inviting people in by saying yes and then again one more time, when we say no, it means something. So and it's actually a way to express our values. So anyway, that's the yes and part. The second one is using curiosity instead of judgment. When we try to use embodied communication in a positive way, we try to go into it with curiosity rather than with judgment. So, for example, if somebody is talking to us and they're saying something that we don't particularly like, I have some examples from improv right here that we don't need to worry too much about. But if somebody says something and we don't like it, or we don't like the way they're saying it, of course our body's going to respond unless we're trained not to let it show. Um, and in some ways, that can be very powerful, that can be useful. What tends to happen to many of us, though, is that we go into the world with a biased cognitive process. We go into a world expecting certain things to happen because we use stereotypes and all of that. When we are truly embodied, when we're truly in our bodies and out of our heads, we can lean forward and listen to people, and we can be curious. We can extend the gift of communication and of curiosity to them. This isn't to say that we should stop being discerning or that we shouldn't have values and boundaries. Of course, we should. But in order for us to collaborate with other people, we have to allow our bodies to indicate that we are curious. And again, we show our curiosity by being open, by asking questions, by letting our face indicate that we're interested. This is very simple stuff. It's very fundamental, but it seems to be true. And then the last thing is that when we're doing true embodied communication in a positive way, we tend to believe that we're with the best people in the best situation. embodied communication is about being present in that particular moment. And then as each moment shifts, our body is going to shift with it. Our curiosity is going to shift with it. It's not about being rigid. It's not about having an unwavering agenda, although there are times when that's necessary. But it's about being open to the world around us. One way that we can do that once our bodies are relaxed is to take on the belief that we are with the best possible people in the best possible situation. And I'm not saying that we have to become Pollyanna-ish or that we have to ignore what's happening, but because people and and time and situations come to us one moment at a time, we do have some choice in that. And we can decide to indicate to people that this is the best place I can be, and that we're in the best possible situation. I can ask one of those questions. It's perhaps, I don't know. I won't try to undermine it before I ask it. But Jamie, if you would help me out here, how do you let people know that you value them and that you are completely in the situation, that you're not thinking about something else or dragging in some kind of narrative that is from the past or that might be limiting or that might be biased? How do you let people know that? What can you do with your body and your voice?
I'm wondering if something like a smile and a nod
Hmm.
can
Yeah,
also be
yeah. Eye contact.
positive.
Hmm. Let me ask this question too, because I this sometimes gets lost. I sometimes forget to say it even. But how can you set up an environment that allows you to be embodied? I know for me, for example, um, if I am rushing out the door, or if I'm looking at my phone, and I never thought I'd be one of those people, but I'm looking at my phone hours a day now. Um, how can you set up an environment that allows you to be physically present and also emotionally and conversationally present? Open body language, repeating what you're hearing. Yeah.
I think facing somebody, in customer service, I talk a lot about, face first and shoulders like present,
Mhm.
shoulders facing the person we're somewhat, talking to. We're not turning away. Or if you're just talking to a coworker in your office, they approach you. We want to turn and face that person. We don't want to keep typing or again have the head down when we're looking at our phone.
Yeah. And that's so true. And that's also, it seems so basic.
I
And yet,
know.
and it's something that we are, as mammals, we are programmed to continually get closer and closer to people. And yet, with this new digital world, I think it's disrupted that quite a bit. Yeah, Lori writes, can I read this out loud? Oh,
Mhm.
my phone face down on the desk or table. Yeah, right. Exactly. So these are all good ways. The other thing too that I like about all these examples, they're wonderful, is that they also show that you have some choice in the matter. There are times when you have to look at your phone. There are times when you have to be typing. Um, and the more mindful and deliberate we become with our communication, the more likely it is we're going to be respectful of other people and be more open to them. And our bodies then will also not feel as depleted as they can. Um, uh, Caitlin writes, giving someone the gift of space to talk, meaning not interrupting um, their pauses, to think. Yeah, being able to just sit with somebody and not having the need or feeling the need to fill in what you think they mean to say. And these are all excellent things. Betty writes, yes, Caitlin, that is wonderful. That's wonderful. It's very strange talking to you without you talking back because I am probably showing all of that kind of regrettable behavior where a silence becomes threatening. Here we go. Um, so, having said all this, if we can get our bodies to relax and if we can begin to take on this cognitive stance and this emotional stance of saying yes, being curious, and being available to people, then our autonomic nervous system will start to respond in ways, if we practice this enough, that that doesn't betray us. And you all know that the autonomic nervous system it governs our ability to fight or to flee. It also can sometimes make us freeze, or we can fall down, we can flop, or we can friend or fawn. We can move toward people. One of the things about embodied communication, if we are consciously trying to grow it, to become more adept at it, is that it will help us begin to see when we are having legitimate fear and when we're reacting in a way, we're having a fight or a flight response to something that doesn't really warrant it. I'll give an example of that. Um, I teach a lot, and it's even to this day, there'll be days when I'll be walking into a classroom or getting onto a Zoom call, and I will feel myself starting to get kind of sweaty, and my heart will be beating a bit, and my mind will begin to address or attach stories to these physical reactions, and oh, I don't want to do this, and will I ever retire? Those kind of things. Um, the more I practice this embodied communication and the more I practice that improvisational mindset, the more I begin to recognize when that's happening. And I say, okay, this is just my body telling an old story. And from what I've read in the chat, you're all aware of this, and it's a very powerful position to be able to say this is a passing thing. Instead, I'm going to go back into my body, and I'm going to just be with my body rather than try to control it or attach stories to it. Um, Elliot writes, and I'll read this out loud if that's okay. I love the acknowledgement of fawning. I very much respond with freeze and fawn, and have been trying to be conscientious of that response and trying to mitigate it through acknowledging my own feelings and responses. That's one of those interesting things, and I'm glad you pointed that out. A lot of times when we become, pardon me, but disembodied, we tend to live our lives for other people in ways that are not terribly healthy. And so, Elliot, I'm glad you pointed that out. Thank you. So, embodied communication helps us deal with our autonomic fight or flight response. Um, it also helps us engage in social engagement. The more comfortable you are in your body, the more you can train your body to serve you and also to be open toward other people, the more you begin to reflect other people's faces, facial gestures, their vocal tone. You give off, and I have this right here in the slide. You give off safety cues. The muscles around your eyes relax, which also helps you smile both from your eyes and also from your mouth. It allows your voice to become more melodious or mellifluous. And what's interesting is that when you're doing this, it's very hard to get the rest of your body, from your shoulders down, to contract. Your vagus nerve is so wandering, it's so pervasive that if one part of you is expressing comfort and happiness and calm, it's very difficult for the rest of your body to go against that. And so this kind of social engagement through embodied communication is very powerful. Just a couple more things before we do question and answers. The other thing too about embodied communication is that it's not about simply being happy. I mean, it's not about being happy or being anxiety free at all. And this is something that I've learned through improvisation. It allows us to have a dialectical reaction to the world around us. And you all know this. It's just simply being able to hold two contradictory stances at the same time. I can be extremely nervous and I can be happy to go to work, or I can be feeling very depressed and I can also recognize that it's time for me to do something that I have a duty toward, work, family, that kind of thing. Um, it often shows itself in that, again, that fight or flight response. And from what I heard in many people from many people in the chat, you can have a really intense fight or flight response, and at the same time, with awareness, you can also think, yes, and I'm overreacting, or I need to do this. Or, yeah, I feel anxious and I want to be on the other side of that and I have to go through this experience. Again, it's your body that's going to tell you things and it's your mind that's going to be able to really test whether this is true or not. We just have a couple more things to go here. Um, Embodied communication allows you to engage in finite and infinite games. We don't have time to talk about this, but if any of you are interested, please check out finite and infinite games. The difference between them is that one has a winner and a loser, and one a finite game is a winner and a loser, and that can be very exciting. But an infinite game is one where you are constantly trying to generate new activity, new emotion. You're trying to include more people. You tend to be more open rather than aggressive and protective. And so, a good conversation is a perfect example of an infinite game. It could go on forever. It has its own energy. It seems to exist between two people. But that only happens if your body is saying, I'm here for you. I'm interested. And I'm also secure enough, I'm relaxed enough to be able to hear what you have to say. And then the final thing is that embodied communication allows us to play. And as adults, we're often told not to play. And that's kind of why, but not kind of why, it's one of the reasons why we tend to have sore backs and our shoulders hurt. And we get a lot of those tension related either disorders or diseases or conditions. And the ability to really honor your body and to be able to express yourself, it can mitigate a lot of that. Not all of it. Some of it, of course, is physiological, but it can allow you then to play again. And when you're being playful, again, you can interact with people in ways that are much more gracious, that are more enjoyable, that are tend to be more physical, and that tend to be more humorous. So with that, I'm done. Jamie, shall we do a Q&A? Is that okay?
Of course. Yeah, we do have a few minutes left. So if you have any questions for Jim, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also put them anonymously in the Q&A. And again, when we're finished today, make sure that you complete, if you have a few minutes, complete the survey at the end, because we're always interested in hearing feedback. I Jim, I think it's interesting, this idea of how you talked about how we can have like dual things happening at the same time. And I, I think of this especially when I'm in front of a crowd or giving a presentation and I'm nervous. And I think we tend to think of that as like a bad feeling. And it was recently I was talking with a news reporter who said, I get nervous and I channel that energy. I look at that nervous energy as like showing that I care. I'm showing that I care about what I do. So I look at that as even though I hate it, I'm sweating and all that, it's a good thing.
Right.
So I love that. Someone asked, how can you pull yourself out of the fight or flight mode faster when you don't have time to do the physical calm down?
That's a great question. There are some physical things you can do, and people mentioned this in the chat. One of the things that really causes the vagus nerve to become stronger, the vagus nerve, it governs our autonomic fight or flight response, is deep breathing. And interestingly enough, particularly through the nose, you tend to oxygenate a lot more by breathing through your nose than through your mouth. Uh,
Hmm.
Also, the ability to hold and release. People talked about box breathing. That is something that you can do in the moment on the spot. Um, the other thing too, and Jamie, you were kind of talking about this. I do think it's important to do the physiological part first, because a lot of times when we jump immediately to talking to ourselves to an internal monologue, unfortunately, those tend to become very directive and kind of shaming, and a lot of times that doesn't help. But if you can just take some deep breaths and relax, it's important to be able to ask the question: is this a legitimate threat, or is my body just reacting? And another thing and this, I thought a lot about this. We have primary stressors. These are the things that scare us. We have secondary stressors, which is our understanding of how well we can cope. Um, I think it's important, and I work on this a lot, to try to remind ourselves that we are capable, moment by moment by moment, we're capable. We might not be able to solve a situation, that's enormous or that is long lasting, but in that particular moment, if we can relax and breathe, we tend to have the skills that we need, even if it means getting out of the situation.
Yeah.
But moment by moment, we tend to do better. So breaking it down to really small increments and trying to be gentle with yourselves too, not judging as much. So,
Thank you. Another question is, if you were leading a presentation with a group of folks who are new to and nervous about public speaking, what exercises would you lead them in beforehand to prepare?
well, I wish that we were doing this. But what I always do is I always have people stand in a circle because a circle that's a stance of equality. And I always have people, as goofy as it is, and it is goofy, I have people look around the room and smile at each other. Uh,
Okay.
and that's all. I always start with that. And then I tend to do exercises where I have people shake their hands together while they're counting. And then I encourage them repeatedly to keep looking outside of yourself and smiling and doing anything physical that is a little bit goofy, and your attention is on somebody else. It tends to break down that self-consciousness because you're all doing it together and now you have this shared experience. Um, and then I repeat over and over and over again that there are all sorts of rules about public speaking, and some of them are very good. But if you spend your time thinking about how many times you said or how many times you moved your
Yes.
hand, if you start to do that, then you're going to become self-conscious and it's not going to work. The thing that I try to get my students to do, and I do this a lot, is to get them really involved, get them committed to something. And it's usually some kind of game or some kind of physical activity. And once they do that, and I always keep it really simple and I never have a winner and a loser. Um, it's amazing how people, once they do that, they really begin to relax because they realize that first of all, most people are thinking about themselves, not about them, and that their self-consciousness is not really warranted. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Yes. I often find, even if I am giving a presentation, and I think we talked a lot about in the other two presentations about like difficult conversations too. So I think a lot of what you talked about today, this relaxing, it doesn't only apply to a presentation, but if you're about to have one of those, a difficult conversation with someone and you need to do some relaxing. But I'll try to find a quiet space, or I might do it even in a bathroom stall if I'm using the restroom before. I'll do that power pose, either the one where you stand with your arms on your hips, or you do the V power pose, and you just holding that pose for like 20 seconds and focusing on that deep breathing. There's something about that, I think, that just again makes you calm, makes you feel powerful or confident or that sort of thing. Someone asked if you do voiceover work. They'd love to listen to more.
I used to. I used to. I don't anymore.
Do you do any are you in set to do any improv or shows in
Yeah.
Wisconsin anytime soon?
In Wisconsin, I don't have anything lined up for Wisconsin, but if you come to the Minnesota State Fair, come to a show called History on a Shtick, and
Okay.
I play Paul Bunyan, and I play a Voyager, and then this past year I was the soil, the Minnesota State soil. So
That's awesome.
I love it. I mean, it's
That's awesome. Well, we are just out of time. Thank you so much, Jim, for this information, for having us do these exercises, especially like after lunch when we're all kind of tired. I think a lot of us appreciated this. Thank you all for your participation and for doing, I'm assuming you did the exercises with us because you participated in the chat. This is the last session in internal communications. We have one more session coming up for the conference, and that's at 2:30. We're going to be hearing from Elnie Gilbert, and she'll be talking about the art of giving great service. So I hope to see some of you there. If not, please enjoy the rest of your day. And so long.
thank you.
Bye, Jim.
Bye bye.